That Saturday afternoon started like any other until Susan's voice cut through the busy pet store like a knife. That $9 feeder mouse you forgot to scan? That's theft. My assistant manager sneered as she waved a disciplinary form in front of stunned customers. Children pointed while their parents whispered, watching Susan write me up at the register. My face burned red with humiliation as shoppers stopped browsing to stare. 23 customers witnessed my public shaming over a computer glitch that wasn't even my fault. That moment changed everything. 18 months earlier, I'd walked into PetSmart as Maxine, a 26-year-old animal lover who'd finally found her dream job. Working with reptiles wasn't just a paycheck for me, it was my passion. I'd spent years studying herpetology, learning about different species, understanding their unique needs and temperaments. My coworkers respected my expertise, and regular customers specifically sought me out for advice on everything from ball python feeding schedules to bearded dragon habitat setups. Jake Morrison was one of my regulars. Every 2 weeks he'd come in to buy feeder mice for his collection of ball pythons. He trusted my recommendations completely, often asking about new morphs or breeding techniques. That particular Saturday, Jake needed his usual supplies plus some substrate for a new enclosure. The store was packed with weekend shoppers, kids' birthday parties, and families adopting their first pets. Our computer system had been glitchy all morning. Registers would freeze mid-transaction, barcode scanners would refuse to read perfectly clear labels, and the inventory system kept timing out. I'd already called technical support twice before noon. When Jake reached the counter with his cart full of supplies, I started scanning his items as usual. The feeder mice came in clear plastic containers with barcode stickers that sometimes didn't adhere properly in the humid reptile room. As I lifted Jake's container, I noticed the barcode had partially peeled off. I tried scanning it 3 times, but nothing happened. The register screen showed an error message. "System's acting up again," I told Jake, typing in the product code manually. I'd memorized the numbers for our most common items after 18 months of dealing with temperamental equipment. The transaction completed normally. Jake paid with his credit card, and he left happy with his purchases. That's when Susan appeared. Susan Rodriguez had been promoted to assistant manager 3 months earlier, and everything changed after that. Before her promotion, we'd gotten along fine. She'd been just another part-time employee, friendly enough during shifts, sharing stories about her cats during lunch breaks. But the moment she got that management badge, something shifted in her personality. Suddenly, she was watching everyone with suspicious eyes. She'd time our bathroom breaks with a stopwatch app on her phone. She'd count register drawers twice, even after other managers had already verified them. She questioned every employee discount usage, demanding receipts and explanations for purchases we were entitled to make. But with me, it felt different, more personal. I noticed Susan positioning herself where she could observe my every transaction. She'd pretend to organize nearby displays while listening to my customer conversations. If I stayed 2 minutes past my scheduled break, she'd make a note in her little book. When I helped customers find products in different departments, she'd follow at a distance, watching. The day after Jake's visit, Susan approached me during the slow Monday morning shift. Her voice carried that new authority she'd been practicing since her promotion. "Maxine, we need to talk about yesterday's transaction with the feeder mice." I looked up from organizing cricket containers. "What about it?" "The barcode wasn't scanned properly. You manually entered a code. The system was glitching. The barcode had peeled off. I used the correct product code." Susan crossed her arms. "How do I know you used the correct code?" The question caught me off guard. "Because I've been doing this for 18 months. I know those codes by heart." "That's not the point. Policy states that all items must be scanned whenever possible." The scanner wouldn't read it. I tried 3 times. "You should have called for manager approval." I stared at her, confused. "For a $9 feeder mouse that I've sold hundreds of times?" "For any manual entry, yes." This was news to me. In 18 months, no manager had ever required approval for manual entries of common items, especially during technical difficulties. But Susan's expression made it clear this wasn't a discussion. That conversation marked the beginning of what I now recognize as a systematic campaign of harassment. Susan began questioning every decision I made, every customer interaction, every transaction I processed. She'd appear whenever I was helping customers, interrupting to ask if I needed assistance with tasks I'd been handling independently for over a year. My coworkers noticed too. Ashley, who worked in dog grooming, pulled me aside one afternoon. "What's going on with Susan? She's been weird around you lately." Brandon from Aquatics agreed. "She asked me yesterday if you'd been acting suspicious. I told her you were the same as always, but she kept pushing for details about your behavior." The harassment escalated gradually. Susan started scheduling me for the worst shifts, closing on Friday nights when drunk customers would stumble in, early morning openings that required arriving before public transportation ran reliably. She denied my time-off requests for my sister's wedding, claiming we were short-staffed, then approved Ashley's vacation the same week. She began nitpicking my customer service, critiquing conversations she'd overheard from across the store. According to Susan, I was too friendly with regulars, too detailed in my explanations, too willing to spend time educating customers about proper animal care. "This is retail, not a classroom," she'd say after listening to me explain proper turtle habitat requirements to a family buying their first pet. But the worst part was how she made me doubt myself. Every shift became a minefield of potential mistakes. I'd second-guess decisions I'd made confidently for months. Simple interactions with customers became stressful when I knew Susan was watching, ready to find fault with anything I said or did. The breaking point came 3 weeks after the feeder mouse incident. I was helping Mrs. Patterson, an elderly customer who'd been buying supplies for her late husband's iguana. She came in monthly for specific vegetables and vitamins, always asking about proper care techniques. She trusted my advice completely, and often mentioned how much she appreciated having someone knowledgeable to talk to about her unusual pet. As I rang up Mrs. Patterson's items, Susan appeared beside the register. "Maxine, did you verify this customer's ID for the reptile vitamin purchase?" I looked at Susan, confused. "ID for vitamins? New policy. All reptile medications and supplements require ID verification." This was the first I'd heard of any such policy. Mrs. Patterson looked embarrassed, fumbling for her wallet. "Oh dear, I don't understand. I've been buying these same vitamins for 2 years. I felt terrible watching this sweet woman's confusion, but Susan stood firm, arms crossed, waiting. Mrs. Patterson eventually found her driver's license, and I completed the transaction while apologizing profusely. After Mrs. Patterson left, I confronted Susan. "There's no policy requiring ID for over-the-counter reptile vitamins. I've never heard of such a thing." Susan's smile was cold. "There is now. I'm implementing new security measures to prevent theft of high-value items. Those vitamins cost $12. They're not high value. That's for management to decide, not you." The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. Susan wasn't enforcing policies. She was making them up as she went along, specifically to make my job difficult and humiliate me in front of customers I'd built relationships with over 18 months. That night, I went home and sat in my small apartment, staring at my collection of reptile care books and wondering if I was losing my mind. Had I really forgotten how to do a job I'd been excelling at for a year and a half? Was I actually making the mistakes Susan kept documenting? But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't about job performance or policy violations. This was personal, and it was targeted. Susan had decided I was a problem, and she was systematically building a case to get rid of me. What I didn't know yet was that while she was focused on destroying my reputation, she was hiding something much worse than a missed barcode scan. The systematic campaign against me intensified over the following weeks. Susan's micromanagement became suffocating. She required her approval for simple customer requests I'd been handling independently, things like setting aside animals for customers to pick up later or explaining return policies for pet supplies. Tasks that used to take 5 minutes now required hunting down Susan for permission, often keeping customers waiting while she deliberately took her time responding. Other employees started expressing concern about Susan's behavior. Ashley confided that Susan had been asking strange questions about my work habits during grooming appointments. She wanted to know if you'd ever mentioned financial problems or if you seemed interested in the expensive animals, Ashley told me during lunch break. I told her you were the most honest person I knew, but she kept pushing. Brandon from Aquatics had similar experiences. Susan asked me to watch your transactions and report anything unusual. When I asked what she meant by unusual, she got vague and said I'd know it when I saw it. The most frustrating part was how Susan's behavior affected my relationship with customers. Jake noticed the change immediately during his next visit. "Everything okay, Maxine? You seem stressed." I forced a smile while gathering his feeder mice. "Just some management changes. You know how corporate can be." But Susan appeared before I could finish the transaction, inserting herself into the conversation. "Is there a problem here?" she asked Jake, as if he'd complained. Jake looked confused. "No problem. Maxine's always been great." Susan's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Good to hear. We're implementing new quality control measures to ensure the best customer service." After Jake left, Susan pulled me aside. "I noticed you seemed flustered during that transaction. Is everything all right with your register skills?" The gaslighting was becoming unbearable. I knew I was performing my job correctly, but Susan's constant questioning made me second-guess every action. The breaking point came when she started making me stay late to recount reptile inventory. According to Susan, there were discrepancies in our snake and lizard counts that needed investigation. These mandatory overtime sessions happened twice a week, always on my closing shifts. "The numbers aren't adding up," Susan would say, handing me printed inventory sheets. "Corporate's asking questions about our reptile department accuracy." I'd spend hours after closing time, counting and recounting every animal in every terrarium, checking heat lamps and water dishes, making detailed notes about each creature's condition. The counts always matched the computer system perfectly, but Susan would find minor issues with my documentation and demand I redo sections. During one of these late-night inventory sessions, something caught my attention. While organizing the reptile room, I noticed gaps in our higher-end animal displays. The terrarium that had housed a beautiful pastel ball python morph was empty, with no sale tag or transfer notice. A $150 blue-tongued skink was missing from its enclosure. The terrarium that had contained our prize breeding pair of crested geckos showed only one animal. I checked the inventory sheets Susan had given me. According to the paperwork, all these animals were still in stock, but the terrariums were clearly empty. Confused, I approached Ashley the next day during her lunch break. "Do you remember what happened to the pastel ball python from terrarium number 12? Ashley thought for a moment. "The really pretty one with the light colors? I think someone bought it last week. Customer seemed really excited." "Did you see the transaction?" "No, but I remember Susan mentioning it sold." "Why?" I showed her the inventory sheet. It's still listed as in stock. Ashley frowned. "That's weird. Maybe Susan forgot to update the system?" But I remembered that ball python. A customer named David had been visiting twice a week for a month, asking questions about care requirements and saving money for the purchase. The snake cost $450, a significant investment for any reptile enthusiast. When I'd last worked with David, he was still $50 short of the full price. During my lunch break, I used Ashley's computer login to check recent sales transactions. Ashley trusted me completely and often asked me to help with her administrative tasks when the grooming schedule got busy. What I found made my blood run cold. The pastel ball python wasn't listed in any recent sales. Neither was the blue-tongued skink. The crested gecko pair appeared to have been sold as individuals on separate dates, but I distinctly remembered them being marketed as a breeding pair to serious gecko enthusiasts. I dug deeper into the transaction records. High-end reptiles were disappearing from inventory without corresponding sales records. But here's what really shocked me. These animals were being marked as medical losses or escaped in Susan's manager notes. A $600 blood python marked as sudden death, medical emergency. A pair of leopard geckos worth $200 each listed as escaped during cleaning. A young monitor lizard valued at $350 recorded as medical euthanasia due to illness. But I remembered every one of these animals being healthy, vibrant, and attracting serious customer interest. The blood python had been eating regularly and showing perfect shedding patterns. The leopard geckos were active and responsive. The monitor lizard was growing rapidly and demonstrating natural hunting behaviors. None of these animals had died or escaped. I would have known reptile health was my specialty, and any medical emergency would have involved me directly. Escape protocols required detailed incident reports and comprehensive cage checks that I'd have participated in. The pattern became clear as I scrolled through months of records. Susan had been marking expensive reptiles as losses while they were actually being sold. But where were these sales happening if they weren't going through our register system? I thought about all those late nights Susan had me staying for inventory counts. While I was busy documenting every cricket and mouse in the feeder rooms, she had unrestricted access to the reptile area. She could easily remove animals, claiming they'd been sold earlier in the day when I wasn't working. The theft was sophisticated. By marking animals as medical losses, Susan avoided triggering computer alerts about missing inventory. Corporate would expect some animal losses due to natural causes, stress, or accidents. A few $100s in monthly losses wouldn't raise red flags, especially spread across different species and time periods. But I estimated the value of missing animals at several $1,000s. If Susan was pocketing cash from these sales, she was stealing more money in a month than I made in salary. The worst part was realizing how she'd been setting me up as the fall guy. All her documentation of my mistakes, all her questions about my behavior, all her emphasis on my access to expensive animals, she was building a case to blame me for the theft she was committing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the pastel ball python, how excited David had been about saving up for it. Had Susan sold his dream snake to someone else for cash? How many other customers had been disappointed when animals they'd been planning to purchase suddenly died or escaped? I thought about Mrs. Patterson and her late husband's iguana, how embarrassed she'd been when Susan demanded ID for vitamins. I thought about Jake's confused expression when Susan inserted herself into our routine transaction. I thought about all the regular customers who trusted me, who came to the store specifically for honest advice and fair treatment. Susan wasn't just stealing money from corporate. She was betraying every customer who walked through our doors, every employee who worked alongside her, and every animal in our care. But I also knew that without solid evidence, my word against a manager's word wouldn't mean much to corporate. Susan had already painted me as unreliable, mistake-prone, and possibly dishonest. If I made accusations without proof, she could easily turn it into a story about a disgruntled employee trying to deflect blame for her own problems. I needed to be smart about this. I needed evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. The next day, I started paying closer attention to Susan's schedule and behavior. I noticed she was working extra shifts, coming in early and staying late even when she wasn't scheduled. She was spending more time in the reptile room, often when other employees were busy in different departments. Most importantly, I noticed she was avoiding the computer system when certain customers came looking for specific animals. When someone asked about high-end reptiles, Susan would immediately declare them unavailable without checking inventory. When customers persisted, she'd claim the animals had been sold or were being held for other buyers. But I knew our inventory intimately. I knew which animals were actually available and which were genuinely committed to other customers. Susan was lying to legitimate buyers while secretly selling their desired animals through some other arrangement. The pieces were falling into place, but I needed concrete evidence before I could expose what Susan was doing. What I didn't realize was that Susan already knew I was getting suspicious, and she was preparing to eliminate me as a threat. I spent the next week carefully gathering evidence. During lunch breaks and slow periods, I photographed empty terrarium tags that still showed animals as in stock on our computer system. I recorded serial numbers from missing animals' original purchase invoices. I printed transaction reports showing the discrepancies between our physical inventory and digital records. The evidence was damning. Over the past 4 months, Susan had marked 17 high-value reptiles as medical losses or escapes, representing over $4,000 in missing inventory. These animals had all been healthy specimens that had attracted serious customer interest before their mysterious disappearances. With my documentation compiled, I decided to approach store manager Robert Chen. Robert had been managing our location for 3 years and had always seemed fair and professional. He'd hired me personally and had given me positive performance reviews throughout my employment. I requested a private meeting with Robert on a Tuesday morning when Susan wasn't scheduled to work. In his small office behind the grooming salon, I laid out my findings carefully and methodically. "Robert, I've discovered some serious discrepancies in our reptile inventory that I think you need to know about." Robert looked up from his computer screen, giving me his full attention. "What kind of discrepancies?" I showed him my photographs of empty terrariums and their corresponding inventory records. I explained the pattern of high-value animals being marked as medical losses despite their healthy conditions. I walked through the timeline showing how these disappearances coincided with Susan's increased access to the reptile room. Robert listened quietly, occasionally asking for clarification about dates or specific animals. When I finished my presentation, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Maxine, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, but I have to tell you something. Susan already warned me that you might make accusations like this." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "She came to me last week expressing concerns about your behavior. She mentioned that you'd been defensive about inventory questions and might try to deflect attention from your own mistakes by blaming others." I stared at Robert in disbelief. "My own mistakes? What mistakes?" "The feeder mouse incident was just the beginning. Susan's documented several issues with your transaction accuracy and attitude toward management feedback." Robert opened his desk drawer and pulled out a thick folder with my name on it. Inside were detailed reports of every interaction I'd had with Susan since her promotion, all framed in the worst possible light. My explanations of computer glitches were characterized as excuses. My questions about new policies were described as insubordination. My customer service interactions were portrayed as time-wasting and excessive. "Susan's been nothing but professional in her approach to employee development," Robert continued. "She's trying to help you improve your performance, and these accusations feel like retaliation against legitimate management feedback." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Susan had manipulated the entire narrative, positioning herself as a dedicated manager trying to help a problematic employee while simultaneously covering her own theft. "Robert, look at the evidence. These animals didn't die or escape. They were sold without being recorded in our system. According to Susan's reports, you've had access to the reptile room during all the times these animals supposedly disappeared. You've worked closing shifts, you stay late for inventory counts, and you have override codes for manual transaction entries." The accusation hit me like a slap. Susan hadn't just been gathering evidence against me, she'd been positioning me as the primary suspect in the very crimes she was committing. "You can't seriously think I'm stealing animals." "I don't know what to think," Robert admitted. "But I know Susan has been documenting problems with your performance for weeks, and now you're making serious accusations against her right when corporate is scheduling their quarterly audit." The timing wasn't coincidental. Corporate audits happened every 3 months, involving detailed inventory reconciliation and financial reviews. If Susan's theft was going to be discovered, it would happen during an audit. By positioning me as the primary suspect beforehand, she could deflect suspicion onto me when the missing inventory was discovered. Robert's next words confirmed my worst fears. "I'm giving you a final written warning for insubordination and making false claims against management. One more incident of any kind, and you'll be terminated immediately. I suggest you focus on improving your own performance instead of looking for problems with other employees." The meeting ended with me signing disciplinary paperwork that effectively made me unemployable if I lost this job. Any future employer checking references would learn that I'd been terminated for theft-related accusations. Walking back onto the sales floor, I felt completely defeated. Susan had outmaneuvered me at every step, using her management position to control the narrative and discredit any evidence I might present. Worse, she'd convinced Robert that I was the real thief, making any future accusations seem like desperate attempts to shift blame. Ashley found me restocking dog food an hour later, my hands shaking as I arranged cans on shelves. "What happened in there? You look terrible." I couldn't tell her the whole truth, not with Susan potentially monitoring employee conversations. Robert gave me a final warning. "One more mistake and I'm fired." Ashley's expression darkened. "This is getting ridiculous. You're the best employee we have. Everyone knows that." But everyone's opinion didn't matter when management had already decided I was the problem. The harassment escalated immediately after my meeting with Robert. Susan began scheduling me for double shifts during her days off, ensuring I had extended access to the reptile room during times she couldn't supervise. She requested security camera reviews of my closing procedures, claiming she needed to verify I was following proper protocols. Most significantly, she started requiring approval for every transaction involving expensive animals, even simple supply purchases for customers I'd worked with for months. When Jake came in for his regular feeder mouse purchase, Susan appeared at the register before I could complete the sale. "I'll handle this transaction," she announced, taking over my register position. Jake looked confused but waited patiently as Susan processed his purchase with theatrical attention to detail, scanning every item multiple times and checking his receipt against the register display. After Jake left, Susan turned to me with mock concern. "I noticed you seemed eager to rush through that transaction. We need to be extra careful with inventory accuracy right now." The message was clear. She was documenting every interaction I had with customers, building a case that I was hasty, careless, and potentially dishonest in my transaction processing. But Susan made one crucial mistake in her campaign against me. She became so focused on framing me for theft that she grew careless about concealing her own crimes. The next week, I noticed her working an unusual number of unscheduled shifts, always during slow periods when fewer employees were present. She was spending extensive time in the reptile room, supposedly reorganizing displays and updating care schedules. But I also noticed she was taking phone calls in the back office, conversations she'd end abruptly when other employees came nearby. Most telling was her interaction with customers asking about expensive reptiles. Instead of checking our computer system or consulting with knowledgeable staff, Susan would immediately dismiss inquiries with vague explanations about animals being unavailable or inappropriate for beginning reptile keepers. But then Jake mentioned something that made everything click into place. "Hey Maxine, weird question, but did Susan ever mention selling reptiles outside the store? She approached me in the parking lot last week asking if I knew anyone interested in buying high-end ball pythons at discounted prices." My heart started racing. "What did you tell her?" "I said I wasn't interested in anything sketchy. I like buying from you because I know the animals are healthy and legally sourced." Susan was approaching customers directly, offering to sell them stolen animals at below-market prices for cash. She was using her knowledge of customer preferences and shopping patterns to target potential buyers who might not ask too many questions about proper documentation. That night, I realized Susan's strategy was more sophisticated than I'd initially understood. She wasn't just stealing random animals. She was specifically targeting reptiles that had attracted customer interest, then offering them to other customers at discounted prices while marking them as losses in our inventory system. Corporate's quarterly audit was scheduled for the following Tuesday. If Susan could successfully frame me for the missing inventory before then, she'd be in the clear when auditors discovered the discrepancies. I would take the blame for months of systematic theft, while she continued stealing with a promoted position and clean record. I had 4 days to prove my innocence and expose Susan's crimes, but I was being watched constantly and had no access to the evidence I needed. Worse, any mistake I made during those 4 days would be used to justify my immediate termination. Susan had played this perfectly, and I was running out of options. Corporate's audit was 5 days away when Susan made her boldest move yet. She approached me during Wednesday's opening shift with what she called a corporate directive that would either expose her crimes or complete my downfall. "Maxine, we need to prepare for the quarterly audit by relocating some of our high-value animals to more secure displays." She handed me a printed list of specific reptiles that needed to be moved, along with new terrarium assignments and updated price tags. According to Susan, corporate had issued new guidelines for audit preparation that required expensive animals to be consolidated in more visible, camera-monitored areas. Looking at the list, my blood ran cold. Every animal Susan wanted relocated was among our most expensive inventory, the surviving high-value reptiles that hadn't yet been marked as medical losses. A $700 reticulated python, a breeding pair of blue-eyed leucistic ball pythons worth over $1,000, and a juvenile green tree python valued at $450. But here's what made my stomach drop. The new price tags Susan provided showed significantly lower values than our actual selling prices. The reticulated python was tagged at $400 instead of $700. The leucistic ball python pair was marked as individual animals at $300 each, not a breeding pair at $1,000 total. "Susan, these prices are wrong. That reticulated python sells for $700, not $400. Corporate wants us to use more competitive pricing during audit periods to show active sales movement." This made no sense. Corporate audits focused on inventory accuracy and loss prevention, not sales volume or competitive pricing. Susan was asking me to help her systematically undervalue our most expensive animals right before an audit that would scrutinize every discrepancy. I realized this was the trap she'd been planning since my meeting with Robert. If I participated in this repricing scheme, I'd be complicit in inventory fraud. If I refused, she could claim I was being insubordinate and have me fired before the audit exposed her real crimes. I don't feel comfortable changing price tags without direct authorization from corporate, I said carefully. Susan's expression hardened. This is direct authorization. I'm your manager, and I'm giving you a corporate directive. Can I see the written directive from corporate? Are you questioning my authority, Maxine? The challenge was deliberate. Susan wanted me to either comply with obvious fraud or give her grounds for immediate termination. Either way, I'd be neutralized before Tuesday's audit. I just want to make sure I understand the policy correctly. The policy is simple. I give you instructions, and you follow them. If you're unwilling to perform basic job duties, we can discuss your future employment right now. I was trapped. Refusing would mean immediate firing for insubordination, but complying would make me an accessory to the fraud Susan was orchestrating. She'd positioned herself perfectly to eliminate me as a threat while covering her tracks before the audit. That's when Ashley appeared from the grooming area, overhearing the tail end of our conversation. What's going on? You both look stressed. Susan quickly shifted her demeanor, adopting a concerned management tone. I'm trying to help Maxine understand some new corporate policies, but she seems confused about following management directives. Ashley looked between us, sensing the tension. Maybe I can help? I've dealt with corporate policy changes before. This specifically involves reptile inventory management, Susan replied. It's outside your department. But Ashley had worked at PetSmart longer than either of us. She knew corporate procedures better than most employees, and her expression showed she found Susan's explanation suspicious. Corporate policy changes usually come with written documentation and training materials. Do you have the memo? Susan's jaw tightened. I don't need to justify management decisions to grooming staff. I'm not asking you to justify anything. I'm asking to see the corporate memo so I can understand the new policy, too. If it affects inventory procedures, it might impact how I document animals coming in for boarding services. The excuse was weak, but Ashley's persistence was making Susan uncomfortable. More importantly, Ashley's questions were being overheard by Brandon from Aquatics, who'd started paying attention to our conversation. You know what? Susan said, backing down. Let me get clarification from corporate about the exact implementation timeline. We'll postpone the repricing until I hear back from district management. It was a tactical retreat, but I knew Susan would find another approach. She couldn't afford to wait much longer. The audit was approaching fast, and she needed to either frame me or eliminate the evidence before corporate accountants started asking questions. That afternoon, I confided in Ashley during her lunch break, choosing my words carefully to avoid giving Susan ammunition if our conversation was reported. I think there might be problems with our reptile inventory that will show up during the audit. Ashley listened as I explained the discrepancies I'd noticed, the missing animals that weren't reflected in our computer system, and the pattern of expensive reptiles being marked as medical losses. You're saying someone's stealing animals and covering it up in the inventory system? I'm saying the numbers don't add up, and I'm worried about what corporate will find during the audit. Ashley was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. If corporate finds major inventory problems, they'll investigate everyone with access to those animals. Exactly. And Susan's been documenting problems with my performance for weeks. If there are missing animals, I'll be the first person they suspect. But you're not stealing anything. I know that, and you know that. But Susan's been building a case that says otherwise. All her documentation about my transaction errors, her complaints about my attitude, her reports about me staying late for inventory counts, it all makes me look guilty. Ashley's expression darkened as she understood the full scope of what Susan had orchestrated. She's setting you up. I think so. And I don't know how to prove my innocence when she controls all the documentation. That evening, Ashley approached Brandon and shared her concerns. Brandon had also noticed Susan's strange behavior around inventory and her obsessive attention to my work schedule. Together, they decided to start paying closer attention to Susan's activities. What they discovered over the next 2 days confirmed my worst fears. Brandon noticed Susan working unscheduled shifts during slow periods, always staying late on nights when she wasn't the official closing manager. Ashley observed Susan making phone calls in the back office, conversations she'd end abruptly when other employees appeared. Most damning was Brandon's observation of Susan's interaction with a customer who'd been asking about expensive fish tank equipment. The customer had mentioned his interest in reptiles, and Susan had immediately steered the conversation toward private sales opportunities. She asked if he was interested in buying high-quality reptiles at competitive prices outside the store, Brandon told us quietly. When he seemed interested, she gave him her personal phone number and suggested he call her directly. Susan was actively soliciting customers for off-the-books sales, using her position to identify potential buyers for the animals she was stealing. This wasn't opportunistic theft. It was a systematic operation that had probably been running for months. But we still didn't have evidence that would hold up against Susan's careful documentation of my supposed problems. Her word as a manager would carry more weight than our suspicions, especially since she'd already convinced Robert that I was the real threat. The breakthrough came on Friday afternoon, when our security cameras malfunctioned in the reptile section. According to Susan, the system would be down for the weekend while technical support resolved the issue. "We'll need to be extra careful about security protocols until the cameras are working again," she announced during our shift meeting. But Ashley had worked retail long enough to know that security camera outages weren't coincidental, especially right before major audits. Corporate stores didn't operate with broken security systems for extended periods unless someone wanted to avoid surveillance. "She's planning something for this weekend," Ashley whispered during closing procedures. The camera outage gives her unrestricted access to the reptile room without leaving video evidence. I realized Susan was planning to steal the remaining high-value animals over the weekend, then claim on Monday that they'd been stolen or had died during the security system outage. By Tuesday's audit, there would be nothing left to steal, and any inventory discrepancies would be explained by the convenient security failure. But Susan made one crucial mistake. She'd been so focused on eliminating evidence and framing me that she hadn't considered how her behavior looked to other employees. Ashley and Brandon had become suspicious, and they were watching her carefully. More importantly, Susan didn't know that corporate's audit procedures had changed since the last quarterly review. Instead of the predictable Tuesday morning start time, auditors were arriving unannounced on Monday afternoon for surprise inventory counts. Susan was planning her final theft for a weekend that would end with immediate corporate scrutiny. She'd built the perfect frame-up for crimes that would be discovered 12 hours before she expected. Tuesday was going to be very interesting. Monday morning arrived with an unexpected phone call that changed everything. Robert gathered all available employees for an emergency meeting at 11 a.m., his expression unusually serious. Corporate will be conducting their quarterly audit starting this afternoon instead of tomorrow morning. They've moved to surprise audit schedules to improve accuracy. I watched Susan's face drain of color. Her carefully planned weekend operation had been designed around a Tuesday morning start time that would give her 12 additional hours to cover her tracks. Now, corporate auditors would arrive in 3 hours to begin immediate inventory reconciliation. The audit team will be here at 2 p.m. for comprehensive inventory counts and transaction reviews. Everyone needs to ensure their departments are properly organized and all paperwork is current. Susan's voice was strained when she spoke. "Will they be checking every department today?" "Full store audit. Every animal, every transaction record, every login activity for the past quarter. They're particularly interested in our reptile department since we've had some unusual loss reports." I felt a mix of relief and terror. Corporate had already noticed the discrepancies in reptile inventory that Susan had been creating. But would they discover Susan's theft? Or would her documentation successfully frame me for the missing animals? The next 2 hours passed in tense preparation. Susan worked frantically in the reptile room, supposedly organizing displays for audit review. But I noticed she was making phone calls every few minutes, her conversations hushed and urgent. Ashley and Brandon positioned themselves where they could observe Susan's activities. What they saw confirmed our suspicions about her weekend plans. "She's removing animals from terrariums and putting them in transport containers," Ashley reported quietly. "She's got at least 3 expensive snakes boxed up in the back office." Susan was attempting to complete her theft operation during regular business hours, knowing that corporate surprise timing had eliminated her window for weekend activity. But conducting theft during store hours was incredibly risky. Any customer or employee could witness her removing animals. At 1:50 p.m., 2 corporate auditors arrived unannounced. David Martinez and Jennifer Walsh introduced themselves to Robert, then immediately began their systematic review process. "We'll start with inventory reconciliation in your highest value departments," Jennifer announced. "Reptiles, then aquatics, then specialty birds." Susan's confidence returned as she guided the auditors toward the reptile room. She'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, armed with detailed documentation of my supposed performance problems and explanations for any discrepancies they might find. "Our reptile specialist Maxine has access to this area during closing shifts," Susan explained as they entered the department. "She's been handling most inventory management and customer transactions for expensive animals." I stood nearby, knowing that my job and reputation depended on what corporate discovered in the next few hours. Susan had positioned herself perfectly to blame me for any missing inventory, while appearing cooperative with the audit process. Jennifer began the systematic count while David reviewed computer records on a laptop. They worked methodically through each terrarium, comparing physical animals to digital inventory listings. The first discrepancy appeared within minutes. Terrarium 12 should contain a pastel ball python valued at $450, Jennifer announced, checking the empty enclosure. "Computer shows it as current inventory." Susan immediately turned toward me. "Maxine, didn't you handle the last feeding schedule for Terrarium 12? The accusation was subtle but clear. Susan was suggesting I had been responsible for the missing snake, but David was already reviewing computer logs on his laptop, and his expression showed concentration rather than concern. "The system shows this animal was marked as a medical loss 2 weeks ago under your management login, Susan," David said calmly. Susan's face flushed. "That's correct. The animal showed signs of respiratory infection and died despite treatment attempts. Do you have veterinary documentation for the medical emergency?" We handled it internally. The symptoms developed quickly." Jennifer looked up from her inventory sheet. "Corporate policy requires veterinary consultation for all medical emergencies involving animals over $200 in value. Where's the incident report?" The question hung in the air as Susan fumbled for an explanation. But David was already pulling up additional records on his laptop, his expression growing more serious. "Susan, I'm showing 17 animals marked as medical losses or escapes under your management login over the past 4 months. That's approximately $4,200 in reported losses. We've had some unusual challenges with animal health this quarter. That's nearly triple the typical loss rate for stores of this size and volume," Jennifer observed. "It's also significantly higher than your historical loss rates before your promotion to assistant manager." The audit was revealing exactly what I'd suspected, but Susan still had her documentation against me. She'd spent weeks building a case that I was responsible for these problems through carelessness or deliberate theft. "I've been documenting performance issues with our reptile specialist that might explain these increased losses," Susan said, producing her thick folder of reports about my behavior. But David was studying his laptop screen with the methodical attention of an experienced auditor, and what he found there made Susan's explanations increasingly difficult to maintain. "These loss reports show interesting timing patterns," David said. "Most incidents occurred during evening hours when you were the only manager present, and many happened on days when Maxine wasn't scheduled to work." Susan's confidence began to waver. I have more direct access to animal care during my management shifts. You also have the only manager login capable of modifying inventory records without secondary approval," Jennifer added. "Every loss report was entered under your personal access code." The technology was betraying Susan in ways she hadn't anticipated. Corporate computer systems tracked every login, every modification, every access attempt with timestamps and user identification. Her manager-level privileges had given her the ability to modify records, but they'd also created a digital trail that proved her exclusive responsibility for the discrepancies. David continued reviewing the data, his voice remaining calm and professional even as the evidence mounted. "I'm also seeing some unusual transaction patterns. Several high-value animals showing sale records followed by immediate cancellations and loss reports. Can you explain these reversed sales?" Susan's explanation came out in a rush. "Sometimes customers change their minds after completing transactions. When animals can't be returned to inventory due to health concerns from brief outside exposure, we mark them as losses. But these particular animals were never actually picked up by customers," Jennifer observed, checking the transaction details. The sales were completed and immediately voided before any animals left the premises. The web of lies was unraveling faster than Susan could explain. Every excuse she offered was contradicted by computer records that showed the exact sequence of her fraudulent activities. But the most damaging evidence was still to come. David's laptop displayed comprehensive login activity for the past quarter, showing every access to inventory management systems and the specific actions taken during each session. Susan, can you explain why your management login shows extensive off-hours access to inventory systems? You've been modifying animal records and processing transactions during times when the store was closed and you weren't scheduled to work. The question was the beginning of Susan's complete exposure. Corporate's new computer systems tracked not just what actions were taken, but when and where they occurred. Susan's after-hours access to modify loss reports and process fake transactions had created an undeniable trail of fraudulent activity. Jennifer looked up from her inventory count with an expression that meant Susan's career was over. David, I think we need to expand this audit into a formal investigation. What happened next unfolded with the methodical precision of an investigation that had been building for months. David closed his laptop and looked directly at Susan with the calm professionalism of someone who'd conducted many similar confrontations. Susan, we need to have a detailed conversation about these inventory discrepancies. Let's use the office for privacy. Robert appeared confused by the sudden shift in audit tone, but he followed corporate's lead as they relocated to the back office. I remained on the sales floor with Ashley and Brandon, all of us understanding that Susan's career was about to end. Through the office's thin walls, we could hear Jennifer's methodical questioning. Her voice remained steady and professional as she presented evidence that dismantled every aspect of Susan's theft operation. Our computer forensics show that every reported animal loss corresponds with after-hours access to inventory systems using your management login. Can you explain why you were modifying loss reports from home at 11 p.m. on multiple occasions? Susan's responses became increasingly desperate as she realized the depth of corporate's investigation. She tried blaming computer errors, claiming her login had been compromised, insisting that other employees had access to her passwords. The system timestamps show these modifications occurring from your personal IP address, David interjected calmly. Our IT department can trace every access point. The technology that Susan thought she'd manipulated had actually documented every aspect of her crimes. Corporate's updated computer systems maintained backup logs that couldn't be deleted or modified, even by management accounts. But the evidence went far beyond computer records. We've also been reviewing your personal banking records, Jennifer announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone backed by corporate legal teams. Large cash deposits that correspond with the timing of reported animal losses suggest a pattern of unreported income. Susan had made the classic mistake of depositing stolen money into accounts that could be monitored. Her recent purchases, vacation expenses, and credit card payments created a financial trail that paralleled the missing inventory she'd been reporting. These deposits are gifts from family members, Susan stammered. We'll need documentation of those gifts for our investigation, David replied. Gifts over certain amounts require tax reporting, and we'll be coordinating with appropriate agencies to verify your explanations. The conversation continued for over an hour, with corporate systematically destroying every excuse Susan offered. They'd clearly been investigating longer than any of us realized, gathering evidence that went far beyond simple inventory discrepancies. When they emerged from the office, Susan's face was pale and her hands were shaking. David addressed Robert with clinical professionalism. We'll need to contact local authorities about theft charges. The evidence indicates systematic fraud involving over $5,000 in stolen merchandise. $5,000. The amount was larger than I'd estimated, representing months of systematic theft that had escalated over time. Susan hadn't just been stealing occasionally. She'd been running a sophisticated operation that treated our store like her personal reptile wholesale business. Jennifer turned to me with an expression of professional respect that I hadn't expected. Maxine, we understand you attempted to report concerns about inventory discrepancies to store management. We appreciate employees who take loss prevention seriously. The vindication felt surreal after weeks of being treated as the primary suspect. Corporate had reviewed Susan's documentation against me and recognized it as a deliberate attempt to frame an innocent employee. Your inventory knowledge and attention to detail helped us identify patterns that might have otherwise gone unnoticed, David added. These investigations often depend on observant employees who care about accuracy. Robert looked shocked as he processed what corporate had discovered. His trusted assistant manager had been systematically stealing while manipulating him into viewing me as the problem employee. But the most satisfying moment came when Jake arrived for his regular feeder mouse purchase, walking into a store buzzing with corporate investigators and confused employees. He approached my register with his usual friendly greeting. "Hey Maxine, the usual supplies for the pythons today." Before I could respond, one of the corporate auditors approached Jake with professional interest. "Excuse me, sir, but we're conducting an investigation into unauthorized sales activities. Has anyone from store management ever approached you about purchasing reptiles through private transactions?" Jake's expression immediately became serious. "Actually, yes. Susan asked if I knew anyone interested in buying high-end ball pythons at discounted prices. She gave me her personal number and suggested I call her directly." The auditor made notes while Jake provided details about Susan's attempted solicitation. His testimony provided direct evidence of Susan's plan to sell stolen animals to customers outside normal retail channels. She said she had access to high-quality animals that weren't moving through regular store sales, Jake continued. "I told her I preferred buying through official channels because I wanted proper documentation and health guarantees." Jake's honesty and integrity had protected him from becoming involved in Susan's operation, but his testimony sealed the case against her. Ashley stepped forward to provide her own observations about Susan's suspicious behavior, her unusual work schedule, and her attempts to manipulate employee schedules around reptile inventory management. "She seemed really interested in making sure certain people worked specific shifts," Ashley told the investigators. "Like she was trying to control who had access to different areas at different times." Brandon added his testimony about Susan's attempts to recruit him for monitoring other employees, her questions about coworkers' financial situations, and her obvious attempts to create suspicion around my work performance. The investigation revealed that Susan's operation was more sophisticated than anyone had realized. She'd been identifying customers interested in expensive reptiles, then stealing those specific animals to sell privately while marking them as business losses to cover the missing inventory. Her systematic documentation against me had been preparation for this exact moment. When corporate discovered the missing inventory, Susan planned to present overwhelming evidence that I was responsible while appearing to be a dedicated manager who'd been trying to address employee theft problems. By 3 p.m., police had arrived to arrest Susan for grand theft and fraud. As she was led away in handcuffs, she made one final desperate attempt to shift blame. "Maxine was my accomplice. She helped plan everything." But the evidence completely contradicted her accusation. Computer records showed she'd worked alone during every theft. Her personal financial records showed individual benefit from the crimes, and witness testimony confirmed she'd been acting independently to frame me for her activities. Jennifer addressed the remaining staff with corporate authority. "Susan Rodriguez is terminated effective immediately for theft and fraud. She's also banned from all company properties and will face criminal prosecution for her actions." Robert stepped forward with an expression of genuine remorse. "Maxine, I owe you a formal apology. Susan manipulated me into doubting your integrity, and I failed to investigate properly when you brought legitimate concerns to my attention." The apology felt good, but what felt better was Jennifer's next announcement. Corporate is promoting Maxine to assistant manager position with full back pay for the time she was unfairly disciplined. Her attention to detail and ethical behavior exemplify the standards we expect from management personnel. Ashley and Brandon applauded, and even customers who'd witnessed the commotion seemed pleased that justice was being served. But the best part came when Jake approached me after the investigators had finished their questioning. "I'm glad you're getting recognized for your integrity. I always knew there was something off about Susan's approach to business, but I couldn't put my finger on what bothered me about her attitude." "What bothered you about her?" "She seemed more interested in making money than caring for animals. You always prioritize the pet's well-being over profits, and that's why I trust your recommendations." That observation captured the fundamental difference between Susan's approach and mine. She'd seen expensive animals as opportunities for personal gain, while I'd always viewed them as living creatures deserving proper care and ethical treatment. The investigation continued for several more hours as corporate documented every aspect of Susan's theft operation, but the immediate crisis was over. Susan was in custody, I was vindicated and promoted, and our store could return to focusing on animal care instead of internal fraud. That evening, as I completed my first shift as assistant manager, I reflected on how quickly everything had changed. 24 hours earlier, I'd been facing termination for theft accusations. Now I was running the department where I'd always excelled, with the support of corporate leadership and the respect of my coworkers. But the real victory wasn't my promotion or Susan's arrest. It was the knowledge that our animals would be protected by honest management and ethical policies going forward. Justice had been served, but the most important lesson was still ahead. 6 months later, I stood in the same reptile room where Susan had nearly destroyed my career, but everything had changed. The terrariums housed healthy animals with accurate price tags, our inventory system reflected actual stock, and customers received honest advice from employees who prioritized animal welfare over profits. Jennifer returned for a follow-up inspection that confirmed what everyone already knew. Our department was operating with the integrity and professionalism that corporate expected. Loss reports had dropped to normal levels. Customer satisfaction surveys showed significant improvement, and our reptile sales were actually higher than they'd been during Susan's tenure. Honest business practices generate better profits than theft, Jennifer observed, reviewing our quarterly results. Customers trust stores where they receive reliable information and ethical treatment. The legal proceedings against Susan had concluded with her conviction on multiple felony charges. She received 2 years of probation, $5,000 in restitution, and permanent termination from retail employment. More importantly, her criminal record would prevent her from exploiting other businesses and employees in similar ways. Robert had undergone additional management training to recognize signs of employee fraud and internal manipulation. He admitted that Susan's systematic documentation had been designed to exploit his management style and his tendency to trust assistant managers without sufficient verification. I learned to distinguish between legitimate employee development and manipulative scapegoating, Robert told me during one of our regular management meetings. Susan was a master at making her problems look like everyone else's mistakes. Ashley had been promoted to lead groomer, Brandon was supervising aquatics, and our store had become known throughout the district for its collaborative management approach and ethical business practices. Corporate used our location as a training example for other stores dealing with internal theft issues. But the most meaningful changes were in our customer relationships. Jake had become more than a regular customer. He'd referred dozens of reptile enthusiasts to our store based on his experience during the investigation. His trust in our integrity had generated a network of customers who valued honest advice over discount prices. I tell everyone that this store actually cares about animals, Jake said during one of his weekly visits. You could make more money selling inappropriate pets to inexperienced owners, but you prioritize what's best for both the animals and the customers. Mrs. Patterson had returned with her late husband's iguana, grateful for a store environment where elderly customers felt respected rather than targeted for unnecessary purchases. Her monthly visits had become highlights of our week, and she often brought friends who appreciated our patient approach to customer education. New customers regularly mentioned that they'd chosen our store because of word-of-mouth recommendations about our ethical practices. Parents felt comfortable trusting us with their children's first pet purchases. Serious reptile enthusiasts respected our expertise, and casual customers appreciated honest guidance about animal care requirements. The financial benefits of ethical practices exceeded what Susan had stolen through fraud. Customer loyalty generated consistent sales, positive reviews attracted new business, and our reputation in the reptile community brought in collectors looking for healthy animals and reliable advice. But the real transformation was in how we approached our work. Every employee understood that customer trust was our most valuable asset, worth far more than any individual sale or short-term profit opportunity. We'd learned to recognize that ethical behavior wasn't just morally right, it was also the most effective business strategy for long-term success. I'd implemented new inventory protocols that made theft nearly impossible while improving efficiency. Multiple employees verified expensive animal transactions, computer access required secondary approval for loss reports, and regular audits ensured that any discrepancies were identified quickly. More importantly, we'd created a work environment where employees felt comfortable reporting concerns without fear of retaliation. Susan's ability to operate undetected had depended on intimidating potential witnesses and controlling information flow to management. The experience taught me valuable lessons about recognizing manipulation and standing up for truth, even when authority figures fail to provide adequate support. Susan's campaign against me had been sophisticated and convincing, but persistence in seeking justice had ultimately protected not just my career but our entire workplace community. I'd learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, to document evidence carefully, and to seek allies among coworkers who share ethical values. Most importantly, I discovered that integrity ultimately protects itself when supported by thorough investigation and honest testimony. The incident had also shown me the importance of systematic thinking in problem solving. Susan's theft operation had been complex and long-term, requiring patient investigation and comprehensive evidence gathering to expose completely. Quick accusations or emotional responses would have been ineffective against her careful planning and documentation. Looking back, I realized that Susan's downfall had been inevitable once corporate implemented modern inventory tracking systems. Technology that she thought she could manipulate had actually been documenting her crimes in ways she didn't understand. Her sophistication in traditional fraud techniques hadn't prepared her for digital forensics capabilities. But beyond the technical aspects, Susan had failed to appreciate the value of authentic relationships with coworkers and customers. Her focus on short-term financial gain had prevented her from building the trust and respect that generate sustainable success in retail environments. Jake's loyalty, Ashley's support, and Brandon's testimony had all stemmed from genuine relationships based on mutual respect and shared values. Susan's manipulative approach to employee management had ultimately isolated her when she needed allies to support her version of events. The reptile room where I now worked as assistant manager represented more than just a career advancement. It symbolized the triumph of ethical practices over fraudulent schemes, of truth over manipulation, of community trust over individual greed. Every day brought opportunities to demonstrate that honest business practices create better outcomes for everyone involved: healthier animals, happier customers, more satisfied employees, and stronger profits built on sustainable relationships rather than temporary deceptions. Susan's theft of $9 worth of feeder mice had been intended to destroy my reputation and eliminate me as a threat to her $5,000 fraud operation. Instead, her accusation had initiated an investigation that exposed her crimes and promoted the very employees she'd tried to frame. Sometimes the people who accuse you the loudest are hiding their own guilt, and persistence in seeking justice protects everyone who depends on ethical leadership. Truth has a way of surfacing when supported by patience, evidence, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when authority figures initially fail to listen. The most important lesson wasn't about retail theft or inventory management. It was about the power of integrity to overcome even sophisticated attempts at deception and manipulation. When you're fighting for truth, you're never fighting alone, because ethical people recognize and support each other even in the most challenging circumstances. 6 months after Susan's arrest, I couldn't imagine working anywhere else. This job had tested my integrity, challenged my persistence, and ultimately rewarded my commitment to ethical practices with a career I genuinely loved and colleagues I genuinely respected. Have you ever encountered someone who tried to blame you for their own mistakes or wrongdoing? How did you handle the situation, and what would you do differently if it happened again? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might help others facing similar challenges. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming workplace challenges and standing up for what's right. Don't forget to share this with anyone who might need encouragement to trust their instincts and fight for truth in difficult situations. Thank you for listening, and remember that integrity always finds a way to shine through, even in the darkest moments of doubt and accusation.